Good morning.
Good morning.
I want to thank you for sharing your worship time so that we could tell you what's happening on the other side. Gideon's is a men's organization. We have around 15,000 Gideons now around the world. We're represented in 129 different countries. We are printing God's Word in 129 different languages. Last year, the Gideons gave away 97 million copies of God's Word. Now that's a number that we have a little trouble grasping, but I'll put it in maybe a term to make it a little easier to remember. That is 3.5 testaments handed out for every beat of your heart. And when you stop and think about it, God's work is still going on. I'd like to tell you a little true story about a testament. It was a Monday morning in a regular little town here in Pennsylvania. Dad was at the breakfast table eating his breakfast and getting ready to go to work. His little daughter rushed in and said, Daddy, look what I got. The Gideons came to the school yesterday and they gave everybody in the 6th grade one of these. And she said, this one's mine. Her dad said, can I see that? She gave it to him and he looked through it a little bit and he said, you don't want this. He said, this is just a bunch of hot air. He said, a bunch of people get together and they try to make you believe that this is all true. And he said, it isn't. He said, they claim in here that a man died, was dead for 3 days, and then he rose up and walked again. He said, now we know that can't be true. So he said, you don't need this stuff. I want that back. So he took her testament, and she was in tears by then. She said, everybody in my class got one. Well, the father said, I'm in charge here, and I'll tell you what you need, and I'll supply what you need, and you don't need this. And he stuck it in his shirt pocket, and he stomped out the door to go to work. A few minutes later, the girl left, still in tears, to catch a bus to go to school. It was a normal day till about noon. Then the alarm whistle started to blow down at the mine. People rushed out in the street and looked down, and black smoke, blue smoke was rolling out of the face of that mine. Things had definitely changed. Emergency vehicles began to roll in. Ambulances came. It was pandemonium. Nobody knew exactly what was happening or what was going on. By evening, the company said that they didn't know if everybody had gotten out yet, but they were going to continue the search. Well, the next morning, very, very early, 2 big drilling rigs rolled in, and it was announced that we're going to sink air holes into the shaft of the mine and begin pumping fresh air down in there. The rescue kits that all the miners were required to carry only would provide air for about 24 hours. And of course, now we're looking at time. This was the beginning of the 2nd day. So the 3rd day went by and the 4th day went by and more equipment came in, and finally about Wednesday or Thursday of that week, 4th or 5th day, the company come out and said, we think everybody is out except one group of men, who would probably be 12 to 14 men in that group. But the air is still too bad. Our rescue teams can't get in. So finally on the 5th or 6th day, they came out and said that all hope was probably going, but they were going to continue to find those till they got them in. So they got in on the 6th, 7th, or 8th day, somewhere in there, and began room to room or search of the mine. And they announced late that one evening they had found the men. They were in a little room by themselves off to the side of the main shaft, and they were going to begin bringing them out the next morning. So the crews went in with the equipment to bring the men out. They stepped into the room, and the one man was laying on the front kind of stretched out, his hands out in front of him. And the other men were sitting around the wall. Some of them leaned against each other, some of them leaned against the wall, and some of them had slid down onto the floor. So they began gathering them up, and they picked up the man in front first. And one of the men who was working there said, "Look, he has something in his hands." So they pried his fingers apart. The little testament was locked into his two hands. So while they were placing him on the stretchers and so on, the man leafed through his testament. And he said, "You know, it says here at the back that I want to give my life to Christ." And he said, "This man signed that." And so they began gathering the men up. As they were carrying him out, the man that still had that testament turned the page and he said, "Oh my goodness," he said, "look, there's 12 other signatures on here. 13 men in that room. They'd all turned it over to Christ that day." God's Spirit still works. It was one testament given to a little girl that had found its way to do what God wanted to do. Sometimes I think that is what we don't do as Christians. This opportunity is there for us. We have somebody at our back that's much more powerful than anything we're going to face. I'd like to wrap this up telling you the true story. In 2022, fellow Gideon from down in the center part of the state went on a Bible blitz to India. And I had the privilege to sit down and talk with him when he came back. And he told us that 21 of them went from the United States. Now, when a Gideon goes on a blitz, the hosting country applies to our headquarters and says, "We think we could pass out so many of these testaments, and so we would like some help," and so on. And it's posted and told to us, Gideons, and those of us who would like to go, we raise our own money and go on these Bible blitzes. This man had done that. He said, when we went to India, he said there was 21 of us. He said there was a man from Britain, 2 or 3 from Australia, several from the United States, and a couple from Canada. He said the first week in India wasn't too bad. He said they divided us up in 2 teams, and the Gideons there are so poor that they have no transportation. So the group had made arrangements to rent a car, a jitney they called it, a big old car that a man owned. And he hauled the Gideons around to the schools, to the hospitals, to the jails, where they were passing out the testaments. And he said first week went all right. And he went out Monday morning in his group, and he said the first school we went to was run by a lady. And he said we began passing out the testaments, and she came out almost hysterical, taking the Bibles from the kids' hands, throwing them on the ground, and saying, you know, "We don't want you here," and this sort of thing. Well, the Gideons are told in those kind of situations, you just walk away. You do not make a scene, do not argue with them. But this lady had called the police before she came out of her office, and the police came. So the men were taken down to the judge or whatever they have in India. And the first thing he did was take their passports. Then he said, "You really should go to jail." He said, "You disturbing the peace or something." But he said, "Our jails are overcrowded and we don't have room for you." And he said, "We don't want to feed you." So the men, it was decided that the jitney operator would take them to the jail every morning at 8 o'clock, and they would stay there until 4:30. Then they would be picked up and taken back to their hotel so that they had a place to sleep and could eat. He said we spent the whole week doing that. He said Friday night the jitney driver came back, and he said we were loading up, getting ready to get out of there, And the jitney driver said, "Could I ask you guys something?" And they said, "Sure." He said, "Why are you doing this?" He said, "I've hauled you around for 2 weeks." And he said, "Your group come to the jail every day." He said, "I've seen you spit on. I've seen you cursed at." He said, "I've seen you thrown out of places." And he said, don't know what you're doing, but he said, "You're giving away these little books." He said, "Why is that so important?" How would you answer that? The men stood and looked at each other a little bit. And finally, the Gideon from Britain said, "Well, if there was a terrible disease and everybody who got it, whether they were man, woman, or child, was going to die, it was a death sentence when they got this disease." He said, "And you found out the cure, what would you do?" The jitney driver studied a little bit. He said, "I don't know." He said, "Well, you could keep it, just use it for yourself and your family and your friends. But, oh, no. Gideon driver said, "I couldn't do that." He said, "I would be the most terrible person in the whole world if I knew the cure for a disease and refused to tell anybody or share it." And the Gideon said, "That's exactly what we have. Anybody who sins falls short and ends in death. It's a death sentence when you start to sin." He said, "We know the cure." He said, "We have the cure." So he said, regardless of what else we do, we have to keep telling our story. We have to keep telling about this cure. And I've thought about that so much since he told me that. That is the story for our churches today. We need to go back to the Bible. We need to realize that this is our commission. This is why we're here. We need to reach the neighbors, reach the friends, reach the people. The Gideons, through their strongest testimony, you might say, is the Bible. We place them in hospitals, doctor's office, dentist's office, anywhere where we think somebody will have a few minutes maybe to sit down and read something that they need to read very badly. Through the Gideons, we have a goal of 1 billion copies of God's Word in 15. We just have 2 more years left. But 97 million last year. We run the years from June to June. But it is happening. We're seeing things, testimonies come back where these Bibles were picked up and changed lives right there, right now. So support the Gideons if you can. And I told this story in Reimersburg here a few weeks ago, and a man talked to me afterwards, and he said, "Do you realize how many people were touched by that one testament that you spoke about?" He said, "Not only the men in there in the mine, but all the miners that worked getting them out and so on." But he said when they went home and told their families, he said, "I'll bet every one of their family members wanted to know what they read in that book." So he said, "It's amazing." And I said, "Yes, these now cost about $1.25. But I said, wouldn't it be something if you had given money to the Gideons and you found out it was your $1.25 that bought the testament that did that job? You have the opportunity. The war goes on between right and wrong. And we are on the front lines for the right if we have the courage to stand up and do it. Thank you.